Today we're gonna talk about the question, what is the best age to raise kids? Not from a medical standpoint, because if you take only medicine into regards, then they will say you as soon as possible, but this does not really work out with a lot of people who became parents very, very soon in their life. And I think this is not a fault. This is by design. So we will have to talk a little bit about nature. And if you're uncomfortable believing that we are just a part of nature and that humans behave well as they should in nature and are a part of nature, but if you really believe that we are some magic beings, angels or something like that, you will have issues with some things I've said. So a little trigger warning to the highly religious over there. So the first thing about this whole question is to point out that we have a choice when we have kids, and if we want to have kids in the first place. This is new. This is really, really new. Back in the day, you not really had a choice when you had sex. You pretty much became pregnant soon after that. So back in the Stone Age, it was no choice. And the thing is, we still run in a lot of regards still on the same operating system as our forefathers and foremothers in the Stone Age. So we are similar to them, and some things that were designed to help us in the Stone Age to survive bite us in the ass right now. So let's start with a very, very, very controversial statement. That is, nobody wants to be a parent. But most of us want to be grandparents. And if you point this out even to people who have themselves no kids and do not want kids, they smirk and smile, and then they say, that's kind of true. Often they say it differently. They say, I do not want to be a parent, but I want to be the crazy aunt or something like that. People by default do not hate kids because we are all the children of people who do not really hated kids. So there is a preference for kids, but most people, and I mean that, do not want to be parents, especially not when they are young. When they become older, it changes somehow, and this is exactly what we have to talk about right now. So back in the day, back in the Stone Age, you had no choice. When you became fertile and sexually active, you had kids. What does this mean? Well, in your lifespan that runs from 0 to about 70. Now it was not 35. A lot of people say, oh, back in the day the people only lived until they were 35. This is only true if you take into account that a lot of people did not reach the age of 4. And if you create then an intermediate level, you run down to 35. But if you had the luck and the rare luck that you became 10, you had a good chance that you become 60. So the average lifespan was between 0 and 70. So what does this mean? When you became a young adult, with around 14, you already became a parent. Quite obviously, for obvious reasons, of course, which meant that your children took again about 14 years to make you a grandparent. So you started to be a grandparent with around 30. I think the best age to become a parent is around 28 and 30. So now you can roll the credits, or you can start to really go deeper into this whole question. So before we can talk more about human beings, we have to talk about the bean, which is pronounced like Mr. Bean. The bean is a concept that is present in German language, but in no other language. And it goes back to Johann Mehring. The idea of the bean is that the state of insects that we call bees act not really as a state. A lot of people, especially in English literature, they will always point out that the bee state is organized like a state, but this is not really true. Mehring pointed out that it is more organized like a superorganism. It is different. It is not an organism in a sense, but it can do things that the individual bees cannot do. For example, a bee is a cold-blooded animal, but the whole bee hive, the bean, does act often like a warm-blooded animal. And this is because the different bees act in a way that the whole thing started to become something else. So if we observe this bean, we can say it is kind of a super organism that is more than the sum of its parts, which is something that the collectivists often like to hear. So how does beans manage that? Do they do what we do? We consist also of a lot of cells. We have blood cells, we have bone cells, we have nerve cells, and so on and so on. Bees do not do that. They produce pretty much only one pattern, but they use a very, very simple and very clever thing. They change the behavior over time. So a bee starts as a bee, and the first 2 days it does nothing else than cleaning. And the 3rd to 5th day it starts to feed the older maggots and start to warm up the brood. And from the 6th to the 12th days it started to feed the younger maggots. Then from the 13th to 18th days it starts to create wax and starts up to build the stock out of wax. From the 15th to the 18th day it starts to take in nectar from the bees who go out to collect nectar and create honey. And then from the 70 to the 21 day it starts to become the warrior to stand guard in the stock. This is the part where they are still quite strong. And then from the 22nd to the 35th day it starts to collect. So the whole life, until about the half of its lifespan, it stays inside of the stock and works inside of the stock. Then in the last part it starts the really important and really dangerous task of flying out and collecting stuff for the stock. So this is always the same bee. There is no bee who decides to become a cleaner or is born as a cleaner. Every bee starts up as a cleaner, and every bee, if it lives long enough, starts to collect honey in the end. So I would suggest, and I know this is a hard one, that our families act in a similar way. It does not mean that we create a superorganism such as the bean. The bean is highly complex and can't survive without that. But can we? If you leave a child and warm it and give it food, it dies. It needs other people. If you take people and put them into solitary confinement, they suffer, and they suffer greatly. So we are dependent. We have this inherent feeling that we are part of the group and we have to be social, otherwise we die, literally. So what I suggest is that we as humans, even though we are so complex and we are able to do so many choices, that we have a similar cycle in our heads as the bees have. And I suggest it looks somehow like that. You start up as a child and you learn skills, you learn it from the tribe, you learn it from the family, you learn what the world is all about. And the next step, when you can run around, you help in the camp. You do minor things, you do not lead these things, but you help by especially the older people who are still all the day long in the camp, and you still learn their skills by helping them, and your help is also appreciated, but you go not really far away from the camp. And then there is a phase of hunting and gathering where you go out into the wild and hunt and gather stuff for the rest of the group. And then you become older and then you carry for the young. And then, well, you die. But before you die, you try to teach as much as possible to the young. The interesting thing is that in the time when you should go out hunting and gathering, this is the time when you already get children. So it makes sense that deep in our psyche, there is a certain skepticism towards our children when we are young. Let's say they are 18 or something like that, or 16, and they should go out into the wild because those are the people who are strong and they are not scarred in the literal sense. When you had a broken bone in Stone Age, it never held completely. So when you had 2 broken bones until you were 30, you are seriously impeded. So those people who are very, very able to go very far and be very effective in hunting and gathering, those people get children because it makes sense that they get children, but they leave them behind in the camp and say, oh, okay, let's leave them there because I do not really know what to do with them anyway, and I do not want to play with a child. I want to go out and kill the deer. But on the other hand, when in the next generation, when it makes no real sense anymore that people go out hunting, when they are not as fast anymore and so on, they keep the rest of the group a little bit down. So then there starts this program that humans start to say, oh yeah, children, it's a nice thing. I stay over here in the camp and I teach them and I care for them and I play with them and so on. And this is what we can observe in a lot of societies who are organized pretty much as we were in the Stone Age nowadays. The old stay in the camp while the young go out, and the young do not have a bad conscience and say, oh my god, I leave my child behind while I go working. This is not what they do. They say, okay, it's not my business. It's the business of the old ones to play with the children. And the interesting thing is when you simulate that, even with us, so when you say, okay, but we are the big mighty Westerner, we work differently because we are about choices. If you put people just in a simulated environment and observe what they do exactly the same. In this wonderful game 1 Hour, 1 Life, where you play from every minute is 1 year, and you start as a child, and when your mother dumps you next to some tree, you die, which is a wonderful game. You see that absolutely naturally all people start to behave more or less in the same way. They start to help when they are young, they start to go out and do their great deeds when they're young, and they leave the children behind. And the old ones, they care about the children and they teach the children. So even in such a simulated environment, this very thing works. And especially if you observe some people when you observe how grandparents interact with their grandchildren, often they interact with their grandchildren a little bit better than with their children. I observe this very, very often. Especially, and they do a very wonderful job, especially if you compare them with very young parents. They do often not a good job. And I have seen that over and over again. Some people who were really not good parents when they were young were absolutely wonderful, sometimes parents, sometimes grandparents, when they were older. So the thing is, a lot of us do not have this infrastructure because our way of living is not really compatible with what we should do, and this means that in our prime we should work and should give our children to our grandparents, and our grandparents should be around 40 and not 70. So to come back to the original question, what is the best age to become a child? It seems to be 30 if you have no social infrastructure, if you have not your parents live with you in the same house. That means quite often. But if there isn't a social infrastructure, it would be a good idea if it is 20. But when you are 20, you have absolutely no idea that when you become 30 or 40, that you say, okay, 10 years before this would be the better idea to get a child. And this is what happens often. So a lot of people who get a child when they were 40 say it would have been a better idea to do that when they were 30 or even younger. Because what does this mean in the end is when you get your child with 30 and your child gets also a child with 30, then you become a grandparent with 60. On the other hand, if the generation only takes 20 years, then you're at 40 with the grandchildren. And this is exactly the sweet spot where a lot of people are really good parents in the end. I mean, they become often then with around 40, they become helicopter parents. Yes, this is not a good thing, but they do a good job in the end, and they do often or pretty much always a better job than a 20-year-old. And I think this is by design. Again, it is very from a biological standpoint. It is clearly nothing that a lot of people out of the humanitarians will agree, because they will point out that I'm an evil Darwinist, and they are right, I am. Because those people who lived by this cycle in the end and got children but did not really care about them, but went out into the wild and collected berries and killed the deer, while the old ones who were not able to do that in the same efficiency stood at home and stood in the camp and cared for the children voluntarily because this was what they really wanted. Those tribes had a benefit, and they had an average against those tribes who were different. So So from my point of view, it makes sense that our ancients were pretty much that. They did pretty much that, and we carry this package to this very day, which ends up, as I stated before, that a lot of people hate children with 20 and with 40 when they really want children next to them, and in reality they want their grandchildren next to them. There are no grandchildren, and it is often also too late to become a child for themselves. So this is really tricky, and especially when you are quite young. I guess it is hard to imagine that you will love children when you're older, especially if you right now are very, let's say, skeptical of children. But for a lot of people, that's the case. For some people, it's not. Some people will never like children and will never want children around them. But I'm around for some time now, and I heard a lot of people say I never want children, and now they are older, and a lot of them, they do not say that anymore. A lot of them are full of regret, and I think we go back to the choice that we now have, if we want to have children or not. To a large degree is not a good thing, because it gives us the opportunity to select a future that is not meant to be our future. So tell me what you think about it in the comment section, especially the young ones, please. I really want to hear their perspective, and of course all of you who are already parents. Tell me what you think about it in the comment section. Like, share and subscribe, and have a wonderful day.